The massive cruise liner that went down at sea was all over the news. After a decade had passed, it lay abandoned on the rocks beneath the water's surface. Mike and Jeff, two young scuba divers, decided to peek inside, but they were unprepared for what they discovered. The reason being, a deafening scream came from a distance as soon as Jeff and Mike boarded the cruise ship. Mike examined the weathered door. The source of the cry, he realized, was within. Attempts to open it were futile because it was locked. As Jeff swept his beam around the area, searching for a pipe of some kind, a large crowbar appeared on the floor. Rushing back to the entrance, Jeff swiftly retrieved the crowbar. Slamming the crowbar onto the lock, he leaned back, knowing he had only one chance at opening the lock. The ship resounded with a resounding boom. Mike hurriedly flung open the door as the lock slid to the floor. The sight within shocked them to their core. All of a sudden, the yelling made perfect sense to them. Immediately, they understood they needed to contact the authorities. What, though, did the underwater explorers discover while at sea? Who or what was the source of the weird screams? For what reason was it necessary for the police to intervene? To make sure you don't miss any of our future stories, hit that like button, subscribe, and bell button before we begin. Despite knowing that no one should go near the partially submerged cruise ship, Jeff and Mike were unconcerned. They were immediately enamored and wanted to hop on it to take a closer look. So, in the wee hours of the morning, when they knew no one would be around to hinder them, the young divers dove in. It appeared like the ship wasn't very sturdy, and they had no idea what was inside. There was a high risk of harm, and there was absolutely no way they could return to land in time in the event that any one of them were to be injured. However, Jeff paid no attention. He had already begun to search for an entrance. Because the ship was slanted, a portion of the top deck was submerged, allowing them to climb onto it and explore for an exit. Being cautious was essential, though. They would plummet into the water if they made even the slightest mistake. With a final glance at Mike, Jeff secured their boat to one of the railings of the cruise. However, Mike did nothing more than sigh and disagree. Even though he had no intention of going inside, he couldn't leave Jeff alone after seeing him ascend the deck. So he took a deep breath and went after Jeff. If only he had realized then what a poor idea that was. As soon as they got inside the cruise, they could feel the weird aura of the ship. It was silent and dark. The only sounds were the cracking of the metal framing and the lapping of the ocean. "Wow," they both said in unison. "We should go back." Mike started, but Jeff had already departed. "Wait up!" Mike yelled as he went after Jeff. His words resonated through the lonely halls of the ship. While investigating the deserted cruise ship, Jeff and Mike found a number of chambers, each with its own creepy vibe. It was fortunate for them that not every room was locked. Upon entering, they were greeted with the main hall's opulence and openness, as well as its towering ceilings and massive staircase that led to the upper decks. On the other hand, there were a lot of cobwebs covering the furniture, and the room was gloomy and dirty. Horrifying evidence of abandonment and neglect was all around them. The next stop was at the claustrophobic cabins, where each room had 2 or 4 beds. However, the mattresses remained undone, and mold and mildew stains marred the sheets. As if the passengers had hurried out the door, they noticed that several of the bags were open and that clothing was lying around the room. A peculiar murmur started echoing around the ship as Jeff and Mike made their way through its deserted corridors. "Heard what I just said?" Mike spoke in a voice that quivered. Still, Jeff showed no signs of alarm. Without saying a word, he simply shrugged and continued. But Jeff would discover the truth in due course. After a little while, Jeff desired to descend even further, to the ship's lower decks. They could have gotten there via a narrow staircase, but it was completely dark. Therefore, they retrieved their phones and utilized their flashlights as navigational aids. A stronger din became audible as they descended. A barely audible, muted cry startled Jeff and Mike to their very core. Fearful expressions crossed their faces as they exchanged glances, but they were determined to continue their investigation. They found themselves in the ship's mechanical area as the stairway abruptly came to a stop. The sound of water falling was audible, and they had to wade through a very thin layer of water. In order to follow the muted sound, they endeavored to be as silent as possible. However, the sound reverberated throughout the ship, further complicating efforts to pinpoint its source. Step by step, they proceeded further into the ship. Anxiety consumed Mike. If something were to happen to them, he knew there was no way for them to return. As he looked over the damp and rusting ship's walls, worst-case possibilities raced through his head. What on earth had he done? They kept on strolling till they eventually came to a stop. They were certain they weren't at the ship's bottom, thus the impasse. On the other hand, Mike made a discovery. He indicated as much. "I spy a door." The door remained jammed despite Jeff's best efforts to free it by grabbing the handle. Listening intently, he rested his ear on the door. He finally spoke up. "The sound is definitely coming from in here." Standing at his side, Mike also rested his ear on the door. "How are we going to gain entry? I can hear it." Out of nowhere, they perceived a sound that nearly halted their hearts. Beside the ship, a boat was drawing near. They could make out the barely audible cries of enraged men arguing. They seemed to be boarding the cruise liner as well. "I knew this was a bad idea," Mike remarked. Their urgency was palpable. They hastily made their way back to the stairwell, but just as they were about to ascend the stairs, they perceived a rumble below. They swiftly pivoted, extinguished their flashlights, and concealed themselves behind the stairway. As the men drew nearer, they fought to hold their breath. They watched as 3 men came down the stairs and walked directly to the locked door. As the men opened the door, the muffled cry increased louder, and Mike got a peek of what was going on inside. He murmured, "We have to get out of here, quickly." Concerned, Jeff gave him the side eye. "Mike, what did you observe? Who's in that room?" However, Mike remained silent. It seemed like a woman was screaming when that happened. "We must assist her," Jeff adamantly stated. Big Mike let out a deep breath. Unfortunately, things had just taken a turn for the worse, and he knew Jeff was correct. The guys were considerably larger and stronger than Mike and Jeff, and they also outnumbered them. To make matters even worse, Mike realized that one of them was carrying a gun. They knew it would take a while before the cops arrived, but they still chose to phone them. Mike gathered all his bravery and agreed with Jeff to peek behind the closed door to see what the men were up to. Gradually, they rose and made their way there, paying close attention to the discourse taking place within. "An individual is aboard this vessel," one of the men remarked. "You saw the lock shattered, didn't you? Her position prevented her from completing that task. They must be still here someplace, since their boat is still docked to the ship." In response, another man said, "You remain here, and I will search the ship." Mike and Jeff ducked under the staircase in a flash, and they watched in the dark as a man emerged from the chamber and made his way upstairs. The sight of the man's concealed weapon made Mike gag, and the prospect of coming face to face with it made him swallow hard. The sound of walking grew fainter, and they listened. "Calm down, Mike," Jeff muttered back as Mike feared for his life. "You must remain vigilant and refrain from becoming overly anxious." Realizing Jeff was correct, Mike let out a sigh. He was anxiously anticipating the arrival of the cops, his heart racing. "Very well," Jeff murmured. "A strategy has been devised. We need to get that man out of the room while we divert his attention to the one upstairs. The question is, how are we going to accomplish that?" "Just the 2 of us," Mike retorted. "Just go with the flow." In the dim light, Jeff felt around. Until Jeff held up a large rock, Mike had no idea what he was looking for. Just as Mike was ready to speak, Jeff threw the rock toward the stairs while holding a finger to his lips. The ship resounded with a resounding boom. Jeff bolted back into the shadows as Mike's eyes widened. Immediately after emerging from the room, the man bolted for the staircase. "Derek!" he yelled out. "I have them!" He bolted up the flight of stairs. Until the sound of his footsteps diminished, Jeff and Mike stood by. They bolted out of the shadows and dashed into the room as soon as they could make out distant, muted noises. Jeff gingerly pried open the hefty door and crept inside. Mike was on the verge of entering when he heard the men making their way back downstairs. Mike was paralyzed with fear and confusion. Just in the nick of time, he dove behind a weathered cabinet. "I truly believed I possessed them," muttered one man. "I warned you to remain in the room with her, you moron." An additional voice yelled out, "I'm going to bind you to her. I will return for you once I locate the invaders." That Jeff was able to get away unscathed was Mike's thought. After retrieving a replacement lock from his pocket, Derek fastened it to the door. He returned to the upper floor after securing the keys to his belt. Mike stood there for a while, bewildered as to what to do. Out of nowhere, the room was filled with an ear-piercing screech. Someone seemed to be rearranging furnishings, but for what reason? Suddenly, it dawned on him. It was a conflict. Mike put his ear to the door in order to hear. Jeff and the man were clearly having a hard time inside. Something was in the woman's mouth, for her muted screams could be heard through the door. An adrenaline rush coursed through Mike's veins. Getting his pal out of danger was his only concern. He dashed frantically toward the upper floor and yelled out, "Derek! Spouse, where are you?" Suddenly, Mike heard heavy footsteps coming his way, and he found himself standing directly in front of Derek, who appeared enraged. Mike uttered a feeble, hey there, as his self-assurance rapidly diminished. Derek remained silent. His hand lingered near his revolver as he casually approached Mike. At last, Derek spoke up. "So, you're the one skulking around this ship. What you've gotten yourself into is completely out of your league." Mike nearly lost control of his bladder due to Derek's scary presence. The only way to free Jeff from that room, though, was to take the keys from Derek's belt, which he was also aware of. It was all over in an instant. Mike was taken aback by the quick transfer of power. He found himself holding the keys as Derek was rendered unconscious on the floor. We could not afford to lose any time. Anticipating Jeff's triumphant return from his battle, Mike sprinted downstairs and opened the door. However, his assessment was incorrect. The other man shot him an angry look as he pried open the door. I didn't like this, almost like something out of an action flick. It took Mike's brain only a few seconds to scan the whole room. He noticed the woman bound to a chair. Jeff sprawled on the floor, and most importantly, the man was going to strike him in the face. Still, Mike found a way to defuse the issue. As he stood in the doorway, he pretended to be confident. His demeanor remained composed as he hailed the person. "Derek, are you my partner? Upstairs he's unconscious, I'm afraid." Unfazed, the man's expression betrayed his menacing nature. He suddenly fell to the ground just as he was going to swing at Mike. He looked over to see Jeff standing behind him, crowbar in hand, as he collapsed. Jeff had sneaked up on the man without his knowing and hit him over the head at the perfect moment. Both men were knocked out, but they needed to act quickly. They might be roused at any second. The woman was strapped to a chair and had duct tape covering her mouth. Mike and Jeff hurried over to help. She yelled out, "Please, hurry!" as Jeff delicately removed the tape. "Save me from this place." While Jeff attended to her legs, Mike freed her hands. The distant sound of police sirens reached their ears. The woman was too frail to stand on her own, so they helped her to her feet and led her back to their boat. After she got inside, Jeff used some more rope to bind the two men so they couldn't get away. At long last, the cops showed up and they were astounded by what they saw. When summoned, they were unprepared for anything, but this was out of their wildest dreams. After making sure the woman was safe, they hurried inside the ship and apprehended the offenders. Along with Mike, Jeff was transported to the station to be questioned by the police. In the confines of the interrogation chamber, they laid out the events of the past. Even though they had performed a good deed, they were anxious since, after all, they had no business being on that ship. They were worried that someone could come after them for trespassing. The cops, however, behaved in a manner that caught them off guard. Jeff and Mike were not penalized for their courageous actions, but rather praised. Their rescue wasn't just any old woman. She was actually the daughter of the governor. The kidnappers demanded compensation and then severed all communication after holding her hostage for days. She probably wouldn't be here today if Jeff and Mike hadn't intervened. The governor sent his personal gratitude, lauding their bravery and astute reasoning. He expressed his appreciation by presenting them with a check, the size of which rendered them dumbfounded. Both Jeff and Mike needed time to collect their thoughts after the harrowing experience. It seemed surreal, like a scene from a movie. The two of them were now quite wealthy, so they took a risk. They planned to see every continent. They continued to seek out new adventures, despite the feelings of dread and wounds caused by this one. For the rest of their life, they promised themselves they would enjoy every moment to the utmost. Following their heart's desires, Jeff and Mike dove headfirst into the unknown, eager to experience life to the fullest, as if there were no tomorrow.